Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Sevilles. I'm with the City of Detroit's Planning and Development Department, and I am here with Elizabeth Kennedy, who's a registered landscape architect and founder of Elizabeth Kennedy Architects.
Landscape architects.
Landscape architects, my apologies. Black-owned, women-owned, which is pretty unique in the world of landscape architecture, and is the longest surviving firm of its type in the country. And it's tied to Elizabeth's tenacity and her belief in the importance of service to clients and community and emerging professionals that Elizabeth trains and the profession in general and a process of design. The work that she directs quietly challenges mainstream assumptions about the aspirations and needs of underrepresented voices in the face of systems and biases that have long dispossessed the less powerful of spaces and render the people who use them invisible. We may hear a lot of that about Detroit actually here. Elizabeth is best known for projects at the intersection of social justice and design that exemplify landscape architecture's potential to engage a broader critical understanding of place and identity. It's from this perspective and standpoint that Elizabeth teaches, directs, critiques, frames, collaborates, and edits, whether if it's in her studio or in through national debate. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
And we also have another esteemed colleague, this time in architecture. Let me get that straight. We have June Grant, who's a registered architect and a member of the National Organization of Minority Architects. She is a designer, an architect, and researcher committed to the craft of buildings and their potential to enhance cities and develop socially responsible solutions to complex real-world problems. With June, she says, design means being willing to seek answers to clear, direct questions. And those questions could be such as, what is impeding community connection? How do you really work? Has integration of emerging technology been successful? With millions of square feet of sealed buildings surrounded by turf campuses and just unfriendly parking structures, or underdeveloped downtown urban areas, empty blocks, dilapidated buildings. It's time for a new alternative, and one that brings about cultural intelligence and adaptive and intelligent design in how we begin to apply these solutions. So, welcome, June.
Thank you, John.
And it is my understanding that each of you have a presentation, just as we're talking about the reweaving of urban design for thriving Black communities. And this is taking a perspective from Brooklyn and from Oakland. And I may every now and then weave in a little Detroit here and there. But my understanding is that each of you have a presentation that you would like to talk about and kick us off. So I would say, June, would you like to start, please?
Sure. Thank you so much, John. And everyone who's here, it's difficult for me to tell how many people are here, but I think that count is 142, and hopefully you can all hear me clearly enough. So let me start sharing my screen here. Okay. So before I start, thank you, John and Elizabeth, for participating in this event, in this conference, in this format. You know, deciding this topic took us quite a bit because as designers, both Elizabeth and I, the landscape, the environment within which we design is in constant flux in terms of policy or latest news. as we're on our way to try to find a solution to a particular question. So my presentation today, some of you may have already seen, but I'm going to present this in-law unit story from a different angle. The angle I'm going to talk about today is going to be from more of a personal experience trying to get affordable housing options in African-American communities. And I'm going to start revealing some of the unpleasantness that exists in policy and working with individuals who write and enforce policy as African-Americans try to retain their ground in the Bay Area. So I'm going to hit can you see the full screen now, John?
Yes.
Okay, great. So while we were trying to create the title for this project, it's gone through many, and some of you may have realized that, on the 12th, we had one title. It's mainly about urban housing and urban agriculture, but always with the idea about healthier communities. Then Elizabeth and I spoke a little bit more, and we said, this is really about an unfinished narrative about Black socialization, and our conversations reflect what we're probably facing, each day. There's a new complexity or a new nuance. And then we decided, okay, well, why don't we just integrate the two titles? And then a few days ago, we realized that the title had changed one more time. And this, for me, was quite interesting to watch because it also reflects an attitude towards and discipline. And in policy, and within this digital framework or world that we exist in today, I realize that we are not paying as much credence and credit and understanding that words mean something. They have weight. And in my studio practice, words mean a lot to us. We look at things from both a quantitative statistical position, but also from a qualitative hybrid. And we look for types, like what are the existing precedents, and are we seeing new types evolve, or what types could be created as a result of the complexities that are forced on Black communities, but always with a goal to regenerative solutions. So the image you see is actually text that's on the wall, and the key words for me in that text is exploration, scale, and that the word productive cooperation. And so this presentation is about how trying to get in-law units built for one African-American family resulted in a national campaign that was very productive in nature. And this is a person who really inspired my journey in this. In 2017, Annette asked me to design an in-law unit for her. And while asking or describing her neighborhood, she revealed that she was one of the last 5 African-American families on that community that used to be 24 African-American families. The families had sold their houses because the houses were now worth $1 million, and they would never be able to make that much money themselves. So they realized they were sitting on a gold mine. What was the problem was they could never find access to capital to build an in-law unit, which would have allowed them to stay in the community. They couldn't get access to capital to rebuild, reinvest. This is a story that's happening across the entire Bay Area, but it's particular to the African-American experience. This access to capital means that you can't repair your house. You can't fix that step. You can't fix the house to be able to rent it out. If you're an elderly person and you have a high medical incident, it is quite likely you will have to sell your house simply because you cannot get access to build an in-law unit in the back of your house if you're Black and if you're old. And God forbid you're both Black and old. So what we're seeing in the landscape is a few things, but mainly we're going through a state of the politics of emergency, but also what is also pushing up is a politics of visibility. The hundreds of thousands of humanity who are living on the street are a direct result of the politics that has happened in the past and the politics that continues today. And so now we're in the state of we must protest through being visible in order to address politics that are now emerging and we're creating an emergency situation. But I actually see this as both a role that architects can play, a really incredible and incisive position, because most people think that we draw pretty pictures, but we're here to explain that we do a lot more than that. We take a deep dive into the measurable things, what's going on the ground plane, but we also recognize that a building is part of a public investment system. We also look at some of the soft, intangible things, the implications of building and the implications of what's around it. And at the end of the day, we really are truly committed to trying to find a way to coexist with the urban context. And these are really key points to understand, because that's how we approach the in-law unit as a solution to what's going on our streets, where there are literally, even the people who are unhoused are protesting. Where are they supposed to go? 70,000 people and climbing are sleeping on our streets. And yet when I look at our map and I look at the codes, I can see that we have hundreds of thousands of available backyard structures that meet the requirement to be converted into living units. And the big question becomes, why are we not seeing the conversion rates? Is it that we're not willing to go the extra mile to convert those backyard garages that are filled with bicycles and other things? So I want to unweave this idea that Black people are not interested in building. Black people want to build. Black people want to build in their own communities. They want to build their own solutions. But there are things in place that are preventing these solutions from being implemented. In quote unquote, she is my poster child, but she's also the reason why I've been on this journey for the last 3 years, trying to get an in-law unit built, not just for her, but for all the Black families who wish to build. As it says here, she's a 5th generation African-American homeowner. So she's not one of those African-Americans who's trying to buy a home for the first time. She reflects the 5th generation of the Great Migration, the second wave of migration. So we've been here, they've been here, but what's going on is the capital and the policies in place are pushing them out. So in trying to help Anna, I decided to take a very methodical approach to not just designing the in-law unit, but designing the system that was going to deliver an in-law unit at scale. And so I had to understand what policies were in place, if there are precedent for installing in-law units at the scale I wanted. Thankfully, in Vancouver, 35% of all single-family homes have at least one in-law unit in the backyard. That means a lot of people have 2. And in the Bay Area, we're not even 1% yet in terms of how many in-law units. I also looked at, physically, where could they go? Are we trying to put a structure in a very tight environment, or is there available capacity in the city and in the environment? I also looked at, how are we going to build these in-law units? Was it going to be a factory-based system, or we're building it on site? Are there ways to be a hybrid system? And so in looking at the in-law unit, it wasn't just about the unit itself, but to understand the role it played, that we have to design for the fullness of the human being. And the full experience meant we must address the fact that we have climbing utility bills. We must understand how it's going to be built and delivered out. I wanted.
And I think I'm sorry, we were just experiencing some delay in your delivery. Keep going. Just a little bit. It's still spotty. If you can try and refresh your browser page. Just 1 second. But I think while we're waiting on June to return, I think that she brought up a lot of issues that that we've probably have encountered across the country, especially I would say from Detroit's perspective, the issues of accessory dwellings and how we begin to support them and just how we begin to solve for these spaces to empower the population that is here. We have June is back. Maybe.
Can you hear?
I can hear you now.
Okay, there seems to be a delay. What I'm gonna do is turn my video off and just share my screen.
Yes.
See if that helps. Can you hear me still? All right, perfect. Let's try this again. Because I do want to get to our conversation. Let me know if you can see this.
I can do both.
And you can hear me. Oh, perfect. Okay. The slides are on a timer, so they'll just keep going. So in designing for the full human experience on the right, we're realizing that there's some barriers to implementation. Finance is always the number one. In California, I'm assuming there are others not from California on the event, the California state law allows everyone to build an in-law unit. So there's no zoning that prevents you from building on a single family lot. Administration at most of our cities have gotten better about how to review the drawings, permitting. So there has been movement in terms of local administration. California laws have made it wide open for us to build. But the big thing that has always prevented African Americans from being able to fully experience what's available to other families is, of course, finance. And so while I cannot solve for the full financial industry, what I can understand is who's trying to build and design everything as I can within the framework of what's within my abilities to prove a point. So one of the narratives out there is, of course, few people want to live in in-law units. That's not true. There are many elderly people who would love to live in an in-law unit. Many of them had to sell their homes and end up on the streets, and they would like to return to a home. They would not like to go to an apartment. There are many who have retired who would like to prefer to live in an in-law unit and rent their homes out. And this is actually splices of East Oakland on the left, Central Oakland in the middle, and Deep East Oakland on the right, where I have pulled down and looked at the sizes of the backyard structures that exist today. These structures are typically filled with junk. And if there's someone living in it, it's not up to code. And so what I've done is quantify the policy to see, okay, we actually can fit units that are less than 750 square feet in the backyard because I know the footprint exists already. After World War II, we showed that as a country, we could build every 16 minutes, a new house was framed. 750 square feet is a 2-bedroom unit. So how is it at the end of World War II, we were able to build houses every 16 minutes? And here we are in 2021, and we can barely get a building off every year. I worked closely with many organizations to get the California state law changed so that anyone could build an in-law unit. And this was essential so that we couldn't say that the codes were exploitative and you had to have a certain size lot. We just said anyone could build. But there are efforts on the foot to start to, after we widen the laws, there are efforts on the foot to narrow it one more time. And I'll be sending out an email about that later. But strictly as an architect, what I want to do is simplify the in-law unit so no one could feel that it was outside of their range. And if you're an architect, you know an in-law unit is really a very simple structure. Its superstructure is timber. It's wood framing. And if you look at a post and beam system, it's probably one of the easiest things to put together. You don't need a college degree to do this. And then you skin it with typical stud wall construction. Any local contractor, anyone who's swung a hammer can make this. The other part of my design was to address the idea around community building. Raising a wall has been part of the American history. I have done it personally as an undergraduate, as a graduate student. The idea of building as a community effort is not new, but it's something that has been declining. And I really believe in order for us to address this issue around affordable housing options, we have to physically build it as a neighborhood. That the people who live in the neighborhood have to really decide to come together to start to build together. That we have to accept that the factory model will not solve this problem for us. And if we rely on the factory model, only those who own the factories will be making money off of the venture. So I would rather we start to gain new skills, the skill of communication, the skill of community building through the actual act of building a structure that someone can live in. I know it's kind of blue sky and it's deliberately white on a blue background, but I actually think it's part of the psychology of the Bay Area to work together as a community. This is the basic design of the in-law unit. But the one I want you to pay attention to is the yellow area, where we deliberately design in a deck, because I truly believe that we have to think beyond just housing the body to housing the experiences of a full life. And so that yellow section is where you get to hang out, you get to gossip, you get to play dominoes, you get a space that's outside of the shelter zone. And part of the design also includes a growing vine, because we have to admit in some communities, particularly African-American communities, there is a food insecurity issue. And if we can start to grow our own, we start to address this. And this is also another project we're working on in terms of how we co-locate in-law units to create also urban farming possibilities. And we don't propose these lightly. These are highly engineered solutions where we've looked at every square feet, every product that goes into making the in-law unit, and to make sure that it's handicap accessible. It allows you to age in place. And we've looked at the solar power on the roof and all the utility bills, because we have to admit, as you get older, you are no longer earning as much. And so the responsible thing is to recognize to be very energy efficient. Over the last 2 years, we've gotten quite a bit of support from AARP as they learned more about the study I was doing. And after doing the design, we were able to confirm that we have designs which cost less than $150,000 to construct, that 2 or 4 people could build. And in Oakland, we have 65,000 single family homes. And we know that the amount of people on our streets are approaching 40 to 50,000. So I think through this example, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that in-law units are not just an economic model for sheltering, but they're a model for designing for social conservation and possibly a way of mending back community spirit in a city where I can see we've become very fractured from when I first moved in. So I want to go back to that original slide where words mattered. In 2019, it was a very personal year for me. And I remember distinctly having to make some decisions about who I was going to have conversations with, because I had conversations where I specifically said, Black families wish to build affordable housing units. And the people I spoke to immediately said, homelessness. And what that indicated to me that although I was talking about Black families having an agenda wider than just, I don't want to say use the word just, but wider than homelessness, that they had desires around wealth generation, desires around community conservation, that the only thing that this person could see was homelessness. And so what I'm finding is that while Black people wish to be productive, there are many who refuse and see them more as consumers. And this attitude around words, the inability to hear, is resulted in policies that are very predatory, even though written as inclusionary. And this is actually a new term I've learned this week, predatory inclusion, but it starts to explain what I'm seeing through opportunity zone, and other policies where it's written to be inclusive in some language, but it's actually predatory in the way it's formed because nothing has been done to address the access to capital question. So I'm going to close this out by saying that in this presentation, I'm hoping that I have illuminated or demonstrated that while Black people wish to build, while we know exactly what we want to do, we know exactly how we want to live, we know exactly how we want to build the product, we know exactly where we want to put it. The thing that's really affecting our ability to see quantity, that is scalar numbers of in-law units in our neighborhoods, is not because we don't have the solutions. It's because the people who write policy don't see us as producers. And so to the audience that's here today, my challenge to you is, I actually need you to start talking to the people who are the guardians of capital, because you can't build without capital. And we can always say, well, philanthropy can't solve this problem. They can only address a really small number of solutions. And so what I'm seeing is that all these conversations, whether it's about single family zoning, is a distraction. That doesn't deal with capital. That just provides more wealth for those who already have, and those who already have access to capital. If we are not talking about equity in access to capital, then we're not, I repeat, not going to have a housing solution that is geared towards rectifying 400 years of disparity. What we're going to end up with is a tenancy population, which will continue to grow, of which Black people will have even less wealth than they have today. So I close with this call to action, and I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
Thank you, June. And next up, we will have Elizabeth Kennedy.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. Thank you, John and June. As June was saying earlier, we've had a number of conversations and a number of iterations of this approach to the topic today. And I was telling her as we were strategizing that definitely over the past 6 months, I've been involved in a lot of conversations about Black space, about how Black and Brown people are welcome or not welcome in public space, how we see public space, what public space means to us, and what I call the shared commonwealth is available or not to people. My point of reference is New York, and that's what I'll talk about today. And with the question that came up when June was saying, well, one of the factors we should look at is urban agriculture, I did think that this opened, as June was saying, a conversation that both had to do with, quite frankly, the logistics of implementing urban agriculture in a particular environment like New York. And it's interesting that we also have John participating in this panel, because New York has, in the course of addressing some of its affordable housing issues, has really depleted a great deal of the amount of open space that it had open to the tax rolls before redevelopment. And so how urban agriculture and urban farming is being examined in some other cities, New York actually is in many ways, we frame it differently here. And one of the reasons why this posed an interesting question to me is that urban agriculture is one of the, I almost want to say default positions that is taken in terms of open space availability to communities. I also thought it was really important because in talking about what I call heritage equity over the past 6 months, and with the focus on New York, what I've had to explain to people is that there isn't a lot of awareness that New York was actually a slave state, that African people were enslaved here, and Native American people were disenfranchised here from Dutch settlement in, forgive me if I get the date wrong, but I believe it's 1655 onwards. And Black people have shaped the areas that we know as Brooklyn, as Manhattan, certainly Bronx and Queens and Staten Island. And so our presence has never really been fully examined in a way that the public is generally aware. And so even when you look at Francis Guy's painting of a snowy day in Brooklyn, and your eye is drawn to the white people in the top hats, when you begin to really examine this painting in detail, you see how integral Black lives were to the day-to-day existence throughout New York and New York State. And so what is also not really popularly understood, because New York is what is often called an overbuilt or very hardened environment, is the extent to which New York's agricultural heritage, New York City's agricultural heritage included Black people. And so you have a community like Sandy Ground in Staten Island, which retained its agricultural character well into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And even as you can see in this image of children in the Rossville area, the area remained very rural. Now, this is a larger consideration for Staten Island, but specifically for Sandy Ground, the line between urbanization and ex-urban and rural existence was very fine. And so even with a project that I'm very familiar with, which is the Weeksville Heritage Center, the narrative that centered more around the change at the end of enslavement in New York to a different form of agriculture that was less reliant on the use of less reliant on enslaved labor, and that led to the expansion of urbanization and the expansion of the city of Brooklyn into what we understand as the borough of Brooklyn today. We have a community, which was Weeksville, and a historic site whose narrative is largely framed in terms of this change from agricultural landscape to urban landscape. And indeed, in terms of the interpretive center, one of the devices that we used in its design was to make the space really transformative or transportive by relying on a reference to agriculture that is actually not exactly accurate for the site. But what we have is a current movement to recognize the importance of I want to say a definition of economic activity that is becoming more and more local. And so from a movement that started with extensive community gardening to something that's largely more organized, there is a call for the design community to respond more at an urban design scale regarding the integration of urban agriculture. And in one of our recent proposal exercises, we looked at a very large site as part of a design team, and we're charged with integrating a half-acre urban farm into the urban design. And while we were not successful, we weren't even shortlisted, which was very disappointed. We did look at the scope of how urban agriculture actually begins to inform and I would like to say mold our understanding of open space in its full explanation. So in the center, part of the scope was to design a large park. And with that, you can see just to the right of center, an area that was developed both as a greenhouse and as an orchard and as farm bedding. So with this perspective, one of the issues that as a landscape architect, who also does a lot of work with historical facilities and stewards of historic sites, is the issue of how urban agriculture is actually perceived by the community and understood, and on those bases made accessible to the community, and how that impacts our understanding of place. And whether, one of the larger questions is whether or not these changes in our understanding and the vocabulary of urban agriculture actually lends itself to preservation or displacement of communities in terms of the idea of place. And so even in this image, concept we were responsible for, you can see that with the type of replacement development that goes on in New York now, that the whole idea of open space and what I call the attachment to earth really changes pretty dramatically. So, in looking at this question and in terms of today's discussion, I wanted to revisit the purpose of urban agriculture as it's commonly understood, and that's to address socioeconomic disparities and access to fresh, healthy food, create economically and physically feasible means of localized food production, and create a diverse range of jobs. One of the attractive aspects of urban agriculture is that it employs a wide range of job skill levels, from the very basic to highly sophisticated. But what I again feel is that there's very rarely any sort of discussion about the role of urban agriculture in actually community and historic preservation, which in my definition is creating or what I would call cementing a locally authentic sense of place. So this raised, it's bad form to have a PowerPoint with a lot of words, but here we go. This raised a lot of questions and provocations in terms of today's discussion and in general. It's like, what role can urban agriculture play in resistance to gentrification? How does a means of production that it's actually shares with rural agriculture very slim profit margins, and in this instance a great deal of inefficiencies. In my opinion, urban agriculture is very inefficient and therefore expensive. How do the advantages and constraints of urban agriculture actually begin to shape both policy and its implementation in urban design? And with that, what are the alternate trends that we're seeing in urban agriculture, and how will that again define both sense of place and sense of opportunity for communities? So one of the questions that there's a great deal of scholarship and examination at the moment is looking at this growing split, for want of a better word, between the community gardening level of urban agriculture that was sort of more traditional since the 70s and a commercial urban agriculture which operates at a certain scale. Among other things, urban agriculture is not viable under economically viable under 5,000 square feet, which is still relatively small for an open space of this type of purpose. But this in turn has certain demands on the urban fabric. And with that, given the mix of sort of traditional approaches and now more of the what is called a controlled environment approach, how does this begin to figure into spatial concepts of community? And this is important in my opinion because there is, I want to say, an emotive or a emotive concept of urban agriculture that is challenged by many of the commercial efforts or efforts to make growing in cities commercially viable. And this is a consideration in terms of community that we should address, particularly since urban agriculture is seen as a community redevelopment effort. So one of the questions simply is, what does urban agricultural actually mean? And from my standpoint, it's what makes a farm actually a place. So in researching today's topic and making sure that I wasn't just, among other things, shooting from the hip, it became very clear that New York City itself does not yet have a comprehensive urban agriculture plan. There's a lot of advice, but the policy level decision making reflects the tendency to still see urban agriculture as a very discrete activity within the community. And so unlike a sort of level of scale, effort, and integration that you would see in a city like Detroit, where this image was taken, New York actually now needs an idea of urban agriculture that imagines urban farming as a spatial system. That is definitely not yet in place. And one of the opportunities this raises is the idea of agricultural districting, which actually has a precedent in the history of the city. We had the flower district, we have the garment district, or we had the garment district. We now have the tech district. But what happens in these geospatial definitions is, among other things, the leveraging of the resources that are shared, and with that, again, the definition of place and activity. The criteria that make urban agriculture viable in a city like New York, it is really going to come down to the ability for New York to implement, to be able to think of urban agriculture as a form of infrastructure. And to that end, because of the level of development that already exists in the city, a large part of this, I would imagine, would involve leveraging existing open space systems, which for us are greenways, beltways, and blueways. So if you go to the New York City website on urban agriculture, and for that matter, community gardens, really, you see you definitely see a certain density and pattern to the distribution of these spaces in certain communities. And this is a 2018 map. It'd be interesting to see in 5 years how much this has changed. But if you look at the overlap of what, among other things, Curbed is referring to as the best urban farms in New York, there is somewhat of a disconnect between that community gardening and these commercial enterprises. And you can see how the dialogue around this activity is beginning to filter itself in two ways. The image that's highlighted here is the Brooklyn Navy Yard roof farm, which I'm also very familiar with, as our office worked on this project. So the Navy Yard roof farm and other roof farms in the city of New York, they have a certain romance about them that one person actually commented that you can't have a roof farm in New York without a killer view of Manhattan. And that tends to sort of lend to both an idea of what these farms are and who manages them, but also their accessibility to the communities. And you can begin to ask questions about these operations in terms of how much of the food that is grown on them is actually distributed locally. These types of urban farms are sort of challenged in the type of crops that they grow. There was one observation that many of the more successful commercial ventures actually generate at high profit foods that actually have very little nutritional value. So there's a question about the activity, the commercial activity of the farm in terms of its local impact that really needs to be questioned further. But regardless of the position, the commercial urban agriculture, which I believe offers the opportunity to look at the urban design, integration of urban agriculture at scale, still is contingent on the issues of land, water, and energy. And as I said earlier, urban agriculture is actually, land is very expensive in cities to dedicate to urban agriculture, and especially if you're talking about farming that's at grade as opposed to vertical. Water is a real question as a resource. Right now, a lot of it hinges on the availability of potable water versus non-potable or recycled water, and how that is achieved. And roof farms and vertical farms actually often consume a great deal of energy because, among other things, they need conveyances. There's an also issue of the type of financing, again, that goes into them. The Brooklyn Navy Yard Roof Farm, which we're familiar, was almost $1 million project. And when you look at that in comparison to agricultural land that could be bought for $1 million and put into land trust, those considerations have to be weighed. Also, at the moment, the tax incentives and funding mechanisms that are available for the development of housing, including affordable housing, don't seem to be put towards agricultural efforts in the same way. It might be that the market is emerging and so nobody's actually thought of this, but in terms of an open space strategy, there isn't the financial interest in perpetuating this yet. So while there is a stronger effort towards the idea of urban agriculture in controlled environments, again, you have these questions of the land, water, and energy consumption. The case for commercial urban agriculture as a means of place or a driver of place is that these operations tend to operate at a scale that lends themselves towards cohesiveness. And with critical mass, there is the opportunity for what I would call a sense of earth. And out of that sense of earth is the opportunity of place and groundedness and connection to location that is really important in community preservation. And as an example of this, one of the moves that we're seeing at the moment and one of the opportunities I think that kind of sets a precedent for the city is the New York City Housing Authority's initiative to look at its real estate parcels, which are really very much the traditional towers in the park development, and to see how that land, which is otherwise ornamentally landscaped, can be put to better serving its resident community. And so you have an organization like Red Hook Community Farms, which manages a series of urban farms for NYCHA. But I love this project that I'm featuring here because if you looked closely, you would understand that this is actually a repurposed asphalt ball field, and a farm built at grade, very much the way a roof farm would be built, but without a number of the challenges of conveyance and the energy draws that you have in the controlled environment farming. So how does urban farming live in the imagination of the community? And again, June was talking about the terminology, and in my mind, there's an opportunity to actually look at the poetry of urban farming to inform a greater vision of policy, and to create a framework for a new paradigm, in particular for New York, that has a more expansive view and a more holistic view of what the potential would be. And I end this with again, returning to Weeksville, because first of all, Weeksville's agricultural story is the aspect of its history that resonates a great deal with most of its visitors. And out of that comes the opportunity to interpret that history and that place in many imaginative ways, including, in this instance, I forget the name of this dance troupe that actually danced through the meadow during a performance at the center. And with that, I'll leave it open to conversation. Okay.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And again, thank you, June. Just to note, we're at 6:25 p.m. If there are any questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A and I could read them back. I thought that there were some very interesting points to bring up. I think one of the things that struck me, June, when you were talking earlier about housing the body and housing the experience of the full life, that there's really struck me and got to me as an architect, just in thinking about, we tend to concentrate on the dweller, or actually less so much the dweller and more so much the dwelling. And I think with that one statement and bringing both of them together and realizing that, oh, this has to capture something. This is for a purpose, and this is for a greater purpose. Can you expound on that a bit?
And you know, my statement is a challenge to the prevailing narrative in the Bay Area, especially the term housing. I get almost a rabid response whenever I hear the word housing, because I despise it. Because for me, the word housing is a form of only looking at sheltering, and I call it the file cabinets for human bodies, but not the human. There is no intent to provide for a bigger understanding of what humanity is, what a human being needs, what is a full life. The term housing has been reduced and continually reduced to just about the four walls and a roof. And even when there's a rooftop deck for having cocktails if you're 35, but it's not about a family. It's not about young kids. It's not about an older person. It's not about the complexities of the life cycle. And that's where it really comes from, is this. And having not been originally from here, I am constantly challenging these terms because they're so reductive. And what I really appreciate about what Elizabeth has just presented is the widening of the understanding of not just designing of the building or even just designing of that small piece of extra deck, but what is that bigger conversation that could be had during the design process, or even way before the design process in that policy making process? What is that bigger conversation that we could be having?
And it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think that with the discussion of urban agriculture and just the applications of it in its various forms, be it if it's on a rooftop or if it happens to be an open space. I know in comparison to Oakland and Brooklyn, Detroit may have, at least on paper, a plethora. It may not be as simple as that, but where we actually do have a land ventures policy, or one that is in development, or we do have a program in which residents can purchase city lots, side lots at a relatively nominal cost. But I think that it also brings to mind the pandemic when you think of policy, for instance. And one of the things that was so disruptive with the distribution was just everything was relied on being that you could have a truck deliver something 1,000 miles across the country, and you really need it locally. How does that play into your thought process, Elizabeth, at least, say with regards to policy, and as you mentioned, just with New York City, for instance, needing to develop a policy for urban agriculture?
Well, there's a lot there, John. It's okay.
My apologies.
For me, the navigation of space, whether it's architectural space or landscape space, is a highly personal event. I think one of the challenges is when it's more than one person or two persons or 10 persons, how you marshal a vision or an approach or a policy or a technique around that collectivity. But I think that individual perspective, that the recognition, and June was talking about it in terms of dwelling and home. Trying not to use the housing word there, but but to go to more, let's say, the experiential or the and I've been using the word immersive aspect of this continually, is very much a driver in decision making. I believe that when that's understood, you understand how spaces are made defensible, they're experienced collectively or individually. And so how then ownership, equity, whether or not the equity is psychological or what I was calling heritage equity, is that, we identify with this place. Trust me, my days of going out to dig in the backyard are way past me. So in terms of my own personal understanding of these needs, it's a little bit abstract. But I understand that there are a lot of different factors that are supporting the idea of specifics of place. And I wanted to get, and to me, urban agriculture offers the opportunity to get into specifics of place. And this is why I raised the idea of the district, because New York has this history of having, as I mentioned, the flower district. There was a certain area of Manhattan where there were, chock-a-block vendors selling flowers and competing with each other to sell flowers, and everything was gone by 9:30 in the morning. But that whole understanding of the district as a place had with it a whole series, a whole ecology of economics, of activity, of distribution that cemented even, your idea, if you worked there, if you were invested there, if you owned there. And so we've so removed the language of agriculture from New York City that we're bringing it back by artifice. And so what that means, and I guess for me, the issue is that when you start to resort to artifice, you start to also ignore the people who are present and are situated in place, because they don't fit that notion. So in the same way that June was talking about, the deck is oriented towards the aspirations of the 35-year-old. Everybody enjoys a deck, right? Everybody wants this amenity. And so how you remove the artifice from the conversation in order to make sure that your process is recognizing people that you need to see and hear is very much part of the discipline that needs to be done. How people purport to do that is now the $10 million question. And yeah. In some instances, it's more easily achieved than in others.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think we have one more minute left as far as a question. I don't see any from the audience per se, but I think I want to ask, both of you referred to Black spaces in different ways. And I think part of the myth, and I use that term for lack of a better expression right now, the myth of Black spaces, for those who tend to be afraid of Black people, becomes foreboding, like you can't cross. How does Black space, from your perspective, become something that is shared, but that can still remain distinctly a Black space?
Wow.
In 30 seconds or less.
First of all, we're trying so hard to hold on to what we have and trying to capture what's available as public land to take under our own control, that we're not even concerned about how others feel when they come to visit. That, I mean, our real priority, at least from the East Oakland perspective, which is the group I have the closest affinity to, is the drive to hold and own the land. That is our number one priority.
Mm-hmm.
We're not interested in how others are feeling. We're definitely own, because there's so many forces that are pushing you out that we can't spend our time being concerned about someone else's how they're feeling. And that's the God honest truth.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with June. I would say it more broadly that I think in this age of reckoning, we might be taking a harder look at what segregation actually means, and what equity and segregation and separateness and the nature of the mix. The idea that we're just going to homogenize ourselves and it'll be, fine, might not actually be even appropriate. And I think that needs a hard look. I'm not judging one way or the other, but I think removing from that process the prejudice and pejorative aspects of interethnic, intercultural, interfinancial relationships needs to be looked at. But there's something to be said in holding and protecting identity. And I think that's going to be the debate that we have moving forward, or part of the debate we have moving forward.
And I 100% agree with you, particularly with the last statement, is just the protection of identity. This has been wonderful. I wish we could go longer. This is my first time moderating a discussion, and just so happens to be with some brilliant minds of design. So June Grant, Elizabeth Kennedy, I thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this. And thank Mills College for hosting. This has been really great, really, really great. And I believe it's my understanding that Mills College will be posting this on their YouTube. Time to be determined, but it'll be forthcoming. This will be something shareable. Again, thank everyone for participating, and good night, and
Thank you, John.
weekend.
June, thank you.
John.